The late afternoon sun bathed Greenhill Park in a warm golden hue. The park was a sanctuary of calm in an otherwise bustling city, where old oak trees stretched their arms wide, shielding the winding pathways beneath them. Birds chirped intermittently, creating a melody that blended seamlessly with the distant laughter of children playing in the playground. Martha Johnson, a dignified 65-year-old black woman with silver strands streaking through her curly hair, walked leisurely along the gravel path. She held the leash of her small, aging dog, Buddy, a brown and white terrier whose tail wagged joyfully with each step. Martha wore a neatly pressed cream cardigan over a modest floral dress. Her presence exuded grace and quiet strength. Yet her modest attire was a stark contrast to the affluent surroundings of the suburban neighborhood. Buddy paused to sniff a patch of grass near a bench, giving Martha a moment to gaze at the world around her. She took in the beauty of the park, her mind momentarily drifting to thoughts of her son, James, whose achievements as the Secretary of Defense filled her with immense pride. Unbeknownst to Martha, a pair of suspicious eyes had been fixed on her since she entered the park. Officer Jack Turner, a 38-year-old white policeman, sat slouched in his patrol car on the curb near the entrance. His sharp features were hardened by years of harboring prejudices, and he wore the uniform of authority with an air of arrogance. To Jack, Martha's presence in this predominantly white neighborhood was a red flag. "She doesn't belong here," Jack muttered under his breath. His fingers tapped impatiently on the steering wheel. "What's she up to?" Jack stepped out of his car, his boots crunching against the gravel as he approached Martha. The moment she saw him, a wave of unease washed over her. "Excuse me, ma'am," Jack called out, his tone brisk and suspicious. "What are you doing here?" Martha turned, her face calm but cautious. "Good afternoon, officer. I'm just walking my dog." Jack's eyes narrowed as he glanced at Buddy, then back at Martha. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area. Do you live around here?" "No, officer. I live in the city," Martha replied politely. "But this park is open to the public, isn't it?" Jack stepped closer, his hand resting on the holster of his gun, a subtle yet deliberate intimidation tactic. "Do you have any ID on you, ma'am?" Martha frowned, her composure slipping slightly. "Is there a reason you need to see my ID? I've done nothing wrong." Jack's voice hardened. "Ma'am, I'm not going to ask again." Reluctantly, Martha reached into her purse, her hands trembling slightly. She handed Jack her driver's license, which he snatched from her hand. As he scrutinized the ID, his expression remained cold and detached. "You're a long way from home, aren't you?" Jack sneered. Martha met his gaze, her voice firm despite the insult. "I have every right to be here." But Jack wasn't listening. "Empty your bag," he ordered. "What?" Martha asked, incredulous. "Why?" Jack's patience wore thin. "Do it now, or I'll have to detain you." Feeling the eyes of passers-by on her, Martha slowly opened her bag and began removing its contents. The humiliation stung, but she held her head high. Jack rifled through her belongings, finding nothing but a book, a water bottle, and some dog treats. When Jack found nothing incriminating, his frustration boiled over. "Don't think you can play games with me," he snapped. Martha's voice was calm but firm. "You're making a mistake, officer." Jack's response was a cold chuckle. "We'll see about that. You're coming with me to the station." The ride to the police station was silent except for the crackling of the police radio. Martha sat in the back seat of the patrol car, her hands gripping her purse tightly. She stared out the window, her mind racing with anger and disbelief. Buddy whimpered softly on the seat beside her, sensing her distress. When they arrived, Jack led her inside, his grip on her arm firm and unyielding. The station was bustling with activity, officers typing reports, answering phones, and escorting suspects in handcuffs. Yet, as Jack walked Martha through the main hall, heads turned. Some officers exchanged knowing glances, while others looked away, uncomfortable with the scene unfolding before them. Jack brought Martha to an interrogation room, a stark and sterile space with a metal table and 2 chairs. He gestured for her to sit, then stood looming over her, arms crossed. "Tell me the truth," Jack demanded. "What were you doing in that neighborhood?" Martha looked him in the eye, her voice steady. "Walking my dog." Jack slammed his hand on the table, causing Buddy to bark nervously. "Don't play innocent with me." Martha remained calm, though her heart pounded in her chest. "Officer, you've searched my bag, taken my ID, and brought me here without cause. I know my rights." Her words seemed to infuriate Jack further. "You think you're smarter than me? Huh? I've dealt with people like you before." Martha didn't flinch. "And what kind of people is that?" "Officer Turner." For a moment, Jack's mask slipped, and the ugliness of his prejudice shone through. "Troublemakers," he said coldly. The tension in the room was thick. But before Jack could continue his tirade, a knock at the door interrupted him. Another officer stepped in, whispering something in Jack's ear. Jack nodded curtly and left the room. Martha exhaled deeply, her resolve unbroken. She knew she had to remain calm and collected, but the sting of humiliation was hard to shake. After what felt like an eternity, a young officer entered the room and placed a phone in front of Martha. "You're allowed 1 phone call," he said, avoiding her gaze. Martha dialed the number with practiced precision, her fingers steady despite the storm inside her. After a few rings, a deep, familiar voice answered. "Hello, James," Martha said, her voice soft but firm. "I need your help." "Mama." James Henderson, the Secretary of Defense, immediately recognized the gravity in her tone. "What happened? Are you okay?" Martha quickly explained the situation, sparing no detail. James listened in silence, his anger simmering beneath the surface. "Stay there, Mama," James said, his voice cold and authoritative. "I'll handle this." When the call ended, Martha felt a glimmer of hope. She knew her son would not let this injustice stand. As Martha waited, Jack Turner sat in his office, oblivious to the storm heading his way. He leaned back in his chair, reviewing paperwork with a smirk of satisfaction. In his mind, he had done nothing wrong. This was just another routine encounter with someone who, in his opinion, didn't belong. Jack's arrogance was rooted in a history of unchecked behavior, growing up in a household that openly espoused racist ideologies. Jack had absorbed these beliefs without question. His father, a retired cop, had often boasted about the good old days when officers didn't have to worry about political correctness. Throughout his career, Jack had accumulated a record of complaints, allegations of excessive force, racial profiling, and verbal abuse. Yet, each complaint had been dismissed, thanks to a culture of silence within the department and the support of a few powerful allies. Jack's phone buzzed, pulling him from his reverie. He glanced at the caller ID. It was his boss, Chief of Police Harold Bennett. Jack answered, his tone casual. "Chief, what's up?" The voice on the other end was sharp and unyielding. "Get your ass to my office. Now." Confused but not alarmed, Jack shrugged and headed to the chief's office. He had no idea that his entire world was about to be turned upside down. James Henderson sat in his spacious Washington, D.C. office, surrounded by military reports and files. As Secretary of Defense, his days were often consumed by critical decisions affecting national security. Yet, as soon as his mother called, everything else became secondary. "Martha Johnson was arrested for what?" he repeated into the phone, his voice low and lethal. The head of the police department he had called was fumbling to explain. I wasn't aware. Secretary Henderson, I assure you, this isn't representative of our department," stammered Chief Harold Bennett. James's tone was icy. "Your officer detained and humiliated my mother for walking her dog in a public park. Are you telling me this is routine practice in your department?" Bennett gulped audibly. "Absolutely not. Sir, I'll handle this personally. You'd better, James snapped. And I want Officer Jack Turner's record on my desk by morning. James ended the call, his jaw tight with restrained fury. He glanced at the framed photograph of his mother on his desk. It was from her birthday last year, her smile radiant as she held Buddy in her arms. The thought of someone disrespecting her, humiliating her, made his blood boil. Linda. He called to his assistant through the intercom. Clear my schedule for the rest of the day. I'm going to Green Hill. Jack Turner strolled into Chief Bennett's office with a smirk on his face, still confident that his actions earlier were justified. The chief's office was spacious but stark, with a large mahogany desk and a city map on the wall. Bennett, a seasoned officer in his 60s, stood behind his desk, his face a mask of suppressed rage. You wanted to see me, Chief? Jack asked casually, leaning against the doorframe. Bennett's sharp glare cut through Jack's arrogance. Shut the door and sit down. Slightly taken aback, Jack complied. He noticed a thick folder sitting on Bennett's desk, his name printed across the top. I just got a call from Secretary of Defense James Henderson. Bennett began, his voice tight. Do you have any idea who his mother is? Jack's stomach sank, but he kept his composure. No, sir. Her name is Martha Johnson. Bennett continued. The same woman you arrested today. Jack's smirk faltered. I didn't know. That much is clear. Bennett interrupted, his voice rising. Because if you did, I assume you wouldn't have been stupid enough to harass her in broad daylight. Jack tried to defend himself. Chief, she was acting suspicious. Suspicious, Bennett snapped. She was walking her damn dog, and now, because of your idiocy, the Secretary of Defense is breathing down my neck. Bennett opened the folder and tossed it onto the desk. Do you know what this is? Jack glanced at it nervously. No, sir. It's your record, Turner. Bennett spat. And it's a mess. Excessive force complaints, racial profiling, verbal abuse. How the hell have you stayed in this department for so long? Jack shifted uncomfortably. Those complaints were unfounded. Save it. Bennett interrupted. I've covered for you before, but not this time. Henderson wants answers, and if I don't give him some, this entire department will be under federal investigation. Do you understand what that means? Jack swallowed hard. Yes, sir. Good, Bennett said, leaning forward, because your career is hanging by a thread. Meanwhile, Martha sat in the modest living room of her small apartment, sipping tea and stroking Buddy's fur. The events of the day weighed heavily on her, but she refused to let anger consume her. Instead, she resolved to use her experience to shine a light on the injustice she had faced. Her phone buzzed. It was a call from James. Are you okay, Mama? He asked, his voice filled with concern. I'm fine, son, she replied. But I can't stay silent about this. James hesitated. Mama, I can handle this. I've already contacted the department. I know you'll handle it, Martha said gently. But this isn't just about me. How many others have been treated like this and didn't have someone like you to call? I need to speak out. James sighed, knowing his mother's determination was unshakable. If that's what you want, Mama, I'll support you, but let me make sure you're protected. The next morning, Martha held a press conference outside her apartment building. Journalists and cameras crowded around as she stepped to the podium. Dressed in her Sunday best, James stood by her side, his towering presence a silent testament to his unwavering support. Good morning, Martha began, her voice calm but firm. My name is Martha Johnson. Yesterday, I was detained and humiliated by an officer of the law for walking my dog in a public park. I did nothing wrong, yet I was treated like a criminal because of the color of my skin. The crowd murmured, cameras clicking furiously. This is not just about me, she continued. It's about every person who has been judged, harassed, or mistreated because of prejudice. It's about a system that allows officers like Jack Turner to act with impunity. and it's about demanding accountability. James stepped forward, his voice like thunder. As Secretary of Defense, I've sworn to protect the rights of every American. That includes my mother and everyone like her. I won't rest until justice is served. The press conference made headlines across the country. Martha's courage resonated with people from all walks of life, sparking a national conversation about racial bias in law enforcement. The days following Martha's press conference saw an outpouring of support from the community. Activists organized rallies and marches, holding signs that read, "Justice for Martha and End Police Prejudice." Social media exploded with hashtags like #StandWithMartha and #StopRacialProfiling. At one rally, Martha stood on a makeshift stage in the heart of the city, addressing a crowd of thousands. "This isn't just my fight," she said, her voice ringing out. "It's our fight. We must stand together to demand a better future for our children and grandchildren." The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices a chorus of unity and hope. Meanwhile, Jack Turner found himself increasingly isolated. His colleagues avoided him, his neighbors whispered about him, and his superiors kept him on administrative leave. For the first time, he began to question his actions and the beliefs that had shaped him. But the community wasn't just demanding Jack's accountability. They were calling for systemic change. Activists petitioned for reforms, including mandatory bias training for officers, the establishment of independent review boards for police misconduct, and stronger protections for marginalized communities. Martha became a symbol of resilience and justice, her story inspiring countless others to speak out against injustice. She wasn't just a victim, she was a catalyst for change. The walls of Jack Turner's world were closing in. As the protests and public outrage grew louder, the police department launched a formal investigation into his conduct. This time, there was no way to sweep his actions under the rug. Chief Bennett, under pressure from both the public and federal oversight, ordered an internal review. Jack sat in the stark confines of an interrogation room, much like the one where he had humiliated Martha days earlier. Across the table sat internal affairs officers, their expressions unreadable. "Officer Turner," one of them began, flipping open a thick folder. "We're here to discuss not only your recent interaction with Mrs. Martha Johnson, but also several other complaints filed against you over the years. Let's start with Greenhill Park." Jack's jaw tightened. "I was doing my job." "Your job?" The officer raised an eyebrow. "You detained a 65-year-old woman without cause. Witnesses stated she was walking her dog. Video evidence corroborates this. How do you justify your actions?" Jack shifted uncomfortably. She looked out of place. The neighborhoods had issues with break-ins. "And you assumed Mrs. Johnson was responsible?" the officer pressed. "Because of her race?" Jack bristled. "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to," the officer replied coldly, sliding a stack of papers across the table. "These are complaints filed against you for racial profiling and excessive force. The department overlooked them in the past. That won't happen this time." The weight of his actions began to sink in. Jack's usual arrogance wavered as he realized the investigation wasn't just a formality. The officers continued questioning him for hours, dissecting his career piece by piece. By the time he was allowed to leave, Jack felt the sting of humiliation he had so often inflicted on others. As the investigation unfolded, a video taken by a bystander at Greenhill Park surfaced online. The footage showed Jack confronting Martha, his aggressive tone and demeanor starkly contrasted by her calm composure. The video quickly went viral, shared millions of times across social media platforms. The caption read, "This is what racial profiling looks like in America." The internet erupted. Activists, celebrities, and everyday citizens weighed in, condemning Jack's actions and calling for systemic reforms. News outlets picked up the story, airing segments that juxtaposed the video with Martha's dignified press conference. Martha's voice resonated with viewers. "This isn't about one bad officer," she said during an interview. It's about a culture that allows prejudice to go unchecked. We need accountability, not just for Jack Turner, but for the entire system. Jack, meanwhile, became a household name for all the wrong reasons. Memes and hashtags mocked him mercilessly, and his face appeared on news segments alongside headlines like, "The Face of Police Misconduct." At home, Jack found no refuge. His neighbors avoided him. His wife left with their children to stay with her sister, and his mailbox overflowed with hate mail. For the first time, Jack felt the isolation and scrutiny he had so often inflicted on others. Martha, though reluctant to take center stage, found herself at the heart of a burgeoning civil rights movement. Her story had become a rallying cry, and her presence at protests and events drew massive crowds. One evening, Martha spoke at a packed town hall meeting. The room buzzed with energy as people from all walks of life gathered to hear her speak. Activists, students, and even a few sympathetic police officers filled the seats. Martha stepped up to the podium, her presence commanding despite her modest demeanor. "I never thought I'd be here," she began. "I'm just an old woman who loves her dog and her family. But something happened to me. Something that shouldn't happen to anyone." The room fell silent as she recounted her ordeal, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I was judged not for what I did, but for who I am. And I know I'm not the first. Too many of us have been silenced, ignored, and dismissed, but no more." Cheers erupted from the audience, but Martha raised her hand to quiet them. "This isn't about tearing people down. It's about building something better. We need accountability. We need fairness. And we need to see each other as human beings." The crowd gave her a standing ovation. Journalists in the back furiously typed notes, capturing her words for the next day's headlines. As Martha left the stage, she felt a surge of hope. For the first time, it seemed that real change was within reach. While Martha's influence grew, Jack's life continued to unravel. He had been placed on unpaid suspension pending the outcome of the investigation, and his reputation was in tatters. He spent his days in his small apartment, scrolling through social media and watching his name trend for all the wrong reasons. One evening, he received an unexpected visit from an old friend, Marcus, a black man who had been Jack's teammate on the high school football team. The two hadn't spoken in years, but Marcus had seen the news and felt compelled to reach out. Jack opened the door reluctantly. "Marcus? What are you doing here?" Marcus stepped inside, his expression a mix of disappointment and concern. "I came to talk. You got a minute?" Jack sighed and gestured to the couch. "Sure. Why not?" The two sat in awkward silence before Marcus spoke. "Jack, what the hell happened to you? We grew up together. I never thought I'd see you on the news like this." Jack bristled. "You don't understand what it's like out there. People don't respect the badge anymore." "Respect?" Marcus scoffed. "You think what you did to that woman deserves respect?" "Jack, you didn't just cross a line. You bulldozed through it." Jack stared at the floor, his defenses crumbling. "I don't know why I did it. I've always felt like they're out to get us." "They?" Marcus's voice was sharp. "You mean black people? People like me?" Jack looked up, guilt etched on his face. "I didn't mean it like that." "Yes, you did," Marcus said. "And that's the problem, Jack. You've been so caught up in your own bias that you can't even see the damage you're doing." The conversation was a turning point. For the first time, Jack was forced to confront the ugliness of his beliefs and the pain they had caused. He began to see that the consequences of his actions weren't just personal. They were part of a larger system that perpetuated harm. The public outrage following Martha's story extended far beyond Green Hill Park. Across the country, communities demanded justice and reform. Protesters filled the streets of major cities, their voices unified in calls for accountability. Signs reading "Justice for Martha," "End racial profiling," and "Police reform now" were carried by people of all ages and backgrounds. Martha watched the movement grow from her modest apartment. Though proud of the impact her story had sparked, she felt the weight of responsibility bearing down on her. She became inundated with requests for interviews, invitations to conferences, and calls from advocacy groups seeking her endorsement. One afternoon, James visited her to discuss the broader implications of her story. Sitting across the kitchen table, he clasped his mother's hands. "Mama, this movement has become bigger than any of us imagined. But I need you to promise me something." "What's that, son?" Martha asked. "Don't let them use you as a symbol without your voice being heard," James said firmly. "Too many times, people like you, strong, principled leaders, get pushed aside once the cameras stop rolling." Martha nodded thoughtfully. "I won't let them silence me, James. But this isn't about me anymore. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what I did." Meanwhile, at the local level, the ripple effects were becoming clear. The Green Hill Police Department faced increasing scrutiny. More complaints against Jack Turner surfaced, along with accusations against other officers who shared his prejudices. Calls for independent oversight gained traction, and the department was forced to implement temporary changes to address public demands. As Martha's voice grew louder in the national conversation, journalists began to dig into her past. Her life story, they discovered, was one of quiet resilience and steadfast courage. Born in the segregated South, Martha had experienced the sting of discrimination from an early age. She recounted stories of walking miles to the nearest school for black children, while white children rode buses to schools just a few blocks away. She remembered the humiliation of being turned away from certain stores and the fear of walking alone at night in a town where racial violence was common. One particularly moving memory stood out. Martha's father, a World War II veteran, was denied housing loans under discriminatory policies despite his service to the country. Yet, despite these injustices, her parents had instilled in her a sense of dignity and determination. "Those experiences shaped me," Martha said during an emotional interview. "They taught me to stand tall, no matter how much the world tries to push you down." Her story resonated deeply with audiences. People saw her not just as a victim of injustice but as a symbol of enduring strength. Donations poured into organizations fighting for racial equity, and schools began incorporating Martha's story into their lessons on civil rights. For Martha, the attention was overwhelming but necessary. "If sharing my story helps even one person find their voice," she said, "then it's worth it." The case against Jack Turner culminated in a highly publicized trial. The courtroom was packed with reporters, activists, and community members eager to see justice served. Cameras outside the courthouse captured every arrival, with protesters chanting just beyond the barricades. The prosecution laid out a damning case against Jack. They presented the viral video, witness testimonies, and a litany of complaints from Jack's past. A particularly compelling moment came when one of Jack's former colleagues testified about the culture of bias within the department. "It wasn't just Jack," the officer admitted, "but he was the worst of us. He made it clear he thought certain people didn't belong, and he acted on it." Jack's defense team attempted to argue that his actions were the result of stress and poor judgment, not racial bias. They pointed to his commendations for bravery and his years of service as evidence of his character. But these arguments rang hollow in the face of overwhelming evidence. Martha was called to the stand as the final witness for the prosecution. Dressed in a simple, elegant suit, she approached the stand with quiet dignity. The courtroom fell silent as she began to speak. "I'm not here to destroy Officer Turner's life," Martha said, her voice steady. "I'm here to speak the truth. What happened to me that day wasn't just about one officer's actions. It was about a system that has allowed prejudice to thrive for far too long." Her words were met with tears and solemn nods from the jury. By the time the trial ended, the outcome was clear. Jack Turner was found guilty of misconduct and abuse of power. He was sentenced to community service and mandated to attend racial sensitivity training. Though many believed the punishment was too lenient, though the trial had ended, the work was far from over. Martha continued to advocate for meaningful change. partnering with organizations to push for police reform at the local and national levels. She became a frequent speaker at conferences and rallies, her words inspiring others to take action. One evening, she visited a youth center in her old neighborhood. The center had invited her to speak to a group of teenagers about her experiences and the importance of standing up for what was right. "I know what it's like to feel invisible," Martha told them, "to feel like the world sees you as less than you are. But don't let anyone define you. You have the power to demand better for yourselves, for your communities, and for the generations to come." Meanwhile, Jack Turner struggled to adjust to his new reality. As part of his sentence, he was required to spend 200 hours volunteering in predominantly Black communities. First, he approached the work with resentment, but as the weeks went on, something began to shift. One afternoon, while helping to renovate a community center, Jack struck up a conversation with an elderly man named Mr. Carter. The man shared stories of his youth during the civil rights movement, describing the sacrifices and struggles that had paved the way for progress. "Young man," Mr. Carter said, "it's not too late for you to change, but you've got to want it. You've got to open your eyes and see people for who they are, not what you think they are." Those words stayed with Jack. Slowly but surely, he began to confront the biases he had carried for so long. He realized that his actions had not only hurt others but had also limited his own humanity. As the months passed, Jack took steps to educate himself. He read books about systemic racism, attended workshops, and listened to the stories of those he had once dismissed. Though he knew he could never undo the harm he had caused, he resolved to be better. Months had passed since Jack Turner's trial, and he found himself living a life drastically different from the one he once knew. Stripped of his badge and public reputation, Jack's days were now filled with labor-intensive community service projects and mandatory racial sensitivity training sessions. First, the experience was humiliating, but gradually, it became transformative. One day, while volunteering at a youth mentorship program in a predominantly Black neighborhood, Jack encountered a teenager named Malik. Malik was a 16-year-old with a sharp mind and a quick wit, but he also carried a deep distrust of authority figures, especially the police. "Why are you even here?" Malik asked one afternoon, his tone accusatory. "You think a few hours of community service is going to fix everything you've done?" Jack hesitated, unsure how to respond. "No," he admitted finally. "I don't think it'll fix anything, but I'm trying to understand, to learn, and to do better." Malik studied him for a long moment before shaking his head. "We'll see." As the weeks went by, Jack and Malik began to form an unlikely bond. Jack shared stories of his own troubled youth, growing up in a household filled with prejudice and expectations that shaped his worldview. In turn, Malik shared his experiences with systemic racism, from being unfairly stopped by police to witnessing friends and family members face unjust treatment. "You ever think about how things could have been different?" Malik asked one evening as they painted a mural on the side of the youth center. "All the time," Jack replied quietly, "but thinking about the past won't change it. I can only change what I do now." Through these conversations, Jack began to understand the deep-seated pain and anger that communities like Malik's carried. It wasn't just about isolated incidents. It was about a lifetime of being treated as less than. For the first time, Jack felt the weight of his actions, not as a punishment but as a moral reckoning. While Jack was finding his path to redemption, Martha remained at the forefront of the movement for change. Her work took her to cities and towns across the country, where she met with community leaders, law enforcement officials, and policymakers to push for reform. One of the most impactful moments of her journey came when she was invited to testify before Congress. The chamber was packed with lawmakers, activists, and journalists eager to hear her perspective. "Good morning," Martha began, her voice steady and calm. "I am here today not just as a victim of injustice, but as a witness to the resilience of people who refuse to be silenced." She spoke of her experience in Green Hill Park, the systemic issues it highlighted, and the changes that were desperately needed. She outlined practical reforms, including independent oversight of police departments, mandatory bias training, and the establishment of community policing initiatives. Accountability is not an attack on law enforcement, Martha said, looking directly at the panel of lawmakers. It's a commitment to the values we claim to hold dear: justice, fairness, and equality under the law. Her testimony received widespread praise and reignited conversations about policing reform. Yet, for Martha, the most meaningful feedback came from the people who stopped her on the streets, thanking her for giving them hope. Months after the trial, Jack found himself attending a community event in Greenhill Park. It was part of his continued community service. But this time, he approached the event not with resentment but with a desire to listen and learn. As he helped set up tables and chairs, he noticed a familiar figure standing near the stage. Martha Johnson, poised and elegant as ever, was speaking to a group of attendees. Jack felt a wave of apprehension. This was the first time he'd seen her since the trial. He debated leaving, but something inside him told him to stay. As the event wound down, he approached her cautiously, his hands shoved into his pockets. "Mrs. Johnson," he said quietly, his voice trembling slightly. Martha turned, her expression unreadable. "Officer Turner." "Just Jack," he corrected. "I'm not an officer anymore." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Jack took a deep breath. "I wanted to say I'm sorry for everything, not just for what I did to you, but for all the harm I've caused over the years." Martha studied him, her gaze piercing. "Do you truly understand what you've done?" Jack nodded. "I think I'm starting to. I've been listening, learning. I know I can't undo the past, but I want to be better. I need to be better." Martha's expression softened slightly. "It's not easy to confront your own failings, Jack, but words alone aren't enough. Change takes time and effort." "I know," Jack said. "I'm willing to put in the work." To his surprise, Martha extended her hand. "Then you have my forgiveness. But don't waste this second chance." Jack shook her hand, a sense of relief washing over him. For the first time in months, he felt the faintest glimmer of hope. As the months turned into years, the events surrounding Martha and Jack's story left a lasting legacy. The Greenhill Police Department implemented sweeping reforms, including independent oversight committees and mandatory community engagement programs. Other departments across the country followed suit, inspired by the movement that Martha had helped ignite. Martha continued her work as an advocate, but she also found time to enjoy the simple pleasures of life: walking Buddy in the park, visiting her grandchildren, and tending to her small garden. She remained a beloved figure in her community, her courage and resilience inspiring others to stand up for justice. Jack, too, found a new purpose. No longer a police officer, he dedicated himself to community work, mentoring at-risk youth and advocating for better relationships between law enforcement and marginalized communities. Though his journey was far from easy, he remained committed to becoming a better person. One sunny afternoon, Jack and Malik stood together outside the youth center, admiring a new mural that the community had created. It depicted a diverse group of people holding hands, with the words "Unity through Justice" painted boldly above them. "You think things are really changing?" Malik asked. "They are," Jack replied, slowly, "but they are." Meanwhile, across town, Martha sat on a park bench, watching children play and families laugh. She smiled as Buddy wagged his tail beside her. The world was far from perfect, but for the first time in a long time, she felt hope, because change was possible, and together, they had proven it.